Imagine candlelight flickering against ancient stone, the air vibrating with rumors and fear. Your footsteps echo down freezing corridors, corridors that once belonged to a woman whose very name would haunt history. Elizabeth Bathory, to some, a noblewoman managing vast estates, to others, a monster shrouded in silk, savoring screams beneath chandeliers. But before we utter the word monster, let's remember, Elizabeth was a daughter, a wife, and a mother. She laughed in castle halls, wrote letters to friends, and watched her children grow. Her eyes, said to be sharp and intelligent, studied dancers at court, the starlight over snow. What happened inside her soul when the world outside was darkened by plague, war, and unchecked power? What pain or rage simmered beneath her calm, aristocratic exterior? Tonight on Heinous Crime Files, we blow away centuries of dust to reveal not just a bloody legend, but a real woman, shaped by privilege, suffering, and shadow. Was Elizabeth truly the Blood Countess, a sadistic killer who bathed in her victim's blood? Or was she a tragic casualty of family, fate, and ruthless politics? Welcome back to Heinous Crime Files. If you're returning, you know we chase the truth where others fear to look. If you're new, thank you for joining us in the darkness. Here, we don't just recount grisly tales. We listen for the human voices behind them, caught between terror and sympathy. Elizabeth Bathory was born on August 7, 1560, amid the rolling plains of Nyírbátor, Hungary, into the storied Bathory family, one of the region's most renowned lines of Protestant nobility. Her childhood was spent in the brooding Castle, a fortress rich in legend and family myth. Details of the Bathory coat of arms reflected their lore. A dragon's teeth commemorating ancestors said to have defeated monsters centuries before. For young Elizabeth, the castle wasn't simply stone and shadow. It was a living, breathing heritage, heavy with expectation. From the beginning, Elizabeth's world was marked by privilege and complexity. Her father, Baron George VI Bathory, was descended from princely rulers of Transylvania. Her mother, Baroness Anna Bathory, was herself the daughter of the Palatine of Hungary. She was a niece to Stephen Bathory, eventually the King of Poland and Prince of Transylvania. The Bathory family's reach touched across Central Europe, and their estate bustled with courtiers, servants, and siblings. Yet behind the grandeur lay vulnerability. Elizabeth was reportedly prone to violent seizures as a child, an affliction that medicine of her day could neither explain nor treat. The local remedies, mixing the blood or bone of the healthy with those stricken by falling sickness, spoke to medical limitations and superstitions that shaped everyday life. At times, her headaches and seizures were whispered about, but largely kept secret, symbols both of stigma and sympathy within her family. Education for Elizabeth was not just custom, but destiny. She studied Hungarian, German, Latin, and Greek, excelling far beyond the typical expectations for noble women. Her intelligence was noted as precocious. She challenged tutors, argued philosophy with family, and learned the intricacies of managing estates from a young age. Despite, or perhaps because of, her privilege, the world outside her windows was dangerous. War with the Ottoman Empire, religious strife between Catholics and Protestants, and political intrigue that made her family both honored and threatened. Rumors also buzzed of darker influences in her household. Some later speculated that she was introduced to cruelty by relatives or perhaps by a sadistic aunt, though historians debate whether these tales are fact or retrospective legend. However, there is little doubt Elizabeth grew up witnessing firsthand the harsh realities of feudal power, where landowners often ruled with near absolute authority over peasants, and violence was a fixture of noble life. In every surviving account, Elizabeth Bathory emerges as deeply complex, a brilliant, vulnerable girl destined for exceptional influence, but also for a life shaped by forces she only partly controlled. Movements of history and family could raise or wreck anyone's fate. For Elizabeth, those shadows only lengthened as she reached adolescence, carrying the burdens and temptations of power into adulthood. Elizabeth Bathory's early years were not simply privileged. They were turbulent and shadowed by forces beyond any child's control. By age 4 or 5, she began suffering violent seizures, collapsing suddenly in the midst of grand castle halls or under the watchful eye of her tutors. In a world gripped by superstition, these episodes were called falling sickness. Treatments ranged from a mundane to the grotesque, placing animal bones beneath her pillow, rubbing the blood of healthy outsiders on her lips, and feeding her a mixture of blood and ground human skull after each seizure. These intimate rituals, carried out by concerned family and staff, show Elizabeth surrounded by care, fear, and misunderstanding. Her parents wanted relief for their daughter, yet such practices reflected the era's confusion, where love and horror sometimes intertwined. Imagine a young Elizabeth lying in her chambers, frustrated and afraid as adults whispered, praying for her ailment to end. Yet a deeper, more unsettling influence loomed in her upbringing, her aunt, Clara Bathory. In a flashback to Elizabeth's adolescence, we see a different world, one of stern authority and dark lessons. In the grand and shadowed halls of the Bathory estates, young Elizabeth often found herself under the watch of her Aunt Clara, a woman whispered about in court circles for her intense passions and alleged cruelty. Clara was no ordinary noblewoman. She was rumored to be a bisexual nymphomaniac who reveled in decadence and was entangled in a shadowy aristocratic world rife with occult practices and whispered orgies. Elizabeth, still frail and wide-eyed, was introduced to a harsh education under Clara's influence. Clara was said to be infamous for her brutality, accused of killing 2 of her 4 husbands and meeting a violent death after being raped by an invading Turkish garrison. More than a family member, she became a mentor of sorts, introducing Elizabeth to the darker arts of pain and domination. Through Clara, Elizabeth learned the twisted Roman ways of punishment, the administration of exquisite pain, and the belief that suffering held power. One can imagine a scene where the young Elizabeth watches, fascinated and terrified, as her aunt demonstrated control through infliction. How pain could bend the will, how fear could command obedience. These moments, seared into her memory, planted seeds of a cruel curiosity and resilience that would shadow her life. This flashback is not just speculation. Historians note that Elizabeth maintained a relationship with her aunt well into adulthood, and it's believed these early influences contributed significantly to her later behavior. Her fascination with cruelty may have been born from witnessing Clara's depravity and survival in a brutal, patriarchal society that offered few options to powerful women. Back in the present of young Elizabeth's life, these experiences mingled with personal tragedy and social expectation. Around the age of 13, according to some rumors, Elizabeth gave birth to an illegitimate child fathered by a peasant boy, a secret so fiercely guarded by her family. The child was sent away, and Elizabeth secluded herself, haunted by shame and fear. Despite the emotional storms, Elizabeth was a bright and ambitious young woman. She excelled academically, mastering several languages and absorbing political philosophies that would serve her later in ruling expansive lands. Yet the shadows never left. The torment of illness, the trauma of secrecy, and the harsh lessons from her aunt all converged, shaping a complex soul caught between fragility and ferocity. Elizabeth's early years were a crucible of contradictory forces. Milked blood treatments mingled with whispered lessons in pain. Youthful playfulness shadowed by secret pregnancies. Noble privilege entwined with brutal survival tactics. These shadows formed the contours of a woman who would come to command with iron will and inspire a legend soaked in darkness. Elizabeth Bathory's adolescence shifted dramatically when, at age 14, she became engaged to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a union shaped more by politics than by affection. The match united 2 of Hungary's most powerful families. The the prestigious Bathorys and the influential Nadasties, solidifying strategic alliances and extending the reach of their respective estates. The wedding took place on May 8, 1575, at the Palace of Vrano, now Vranov nad Toplu, Slovakia, in a ceremony attended by over 4,000 guests. Young Elizabeth and Ferenc moved to Castle Čachtice, a brooding fortress gifted to Elizabeth as part of her dowry. The castle, perched atop rolling hills and surrounded by 17 villages, would soon become infamous as the epicenter of whispered horrors and secrets. Ferenc, known as the Black Knight of Hungary, was both a fierce soldier and an ambitious aristocrat. Shortly after their marriage, he became chief commander of the Hungarian army, leading campaigns against the encroaching Ottoman Empire, a role that often kept him distant from his young bride. During these turbulent years, Elizabeth managed the business affairs of their multiple estates, overseeing administrative duties, defending properties near the front lines, and safeguarding the fortunes of both families as war shadowed the region. Life for Elizabeth as a young wife was laden with both privilege and responsibility. Far from being a passive figure, she ruled Čachtice and other estates with remarkable autonomy, while Ferenc waged war. In times of conflict, she was known to organize medical supplies and defenses for villages threatened by Ottoman raids, her role reflecting not only authority, but a kind of forced resilience in a violent era. For the first decade of their marriage, Elizabeth and Ferenc remained childless, a source of anxiety and intrigue among the nobility. Eventually, the births of several children brought relief and new duties. Their daughter, Anna, was born in 1585, Orshalia followed in 1590, Catalin in 1594, Andres in 1596, and their son Paul in 1598. Rumors swirled about the circumstances of each birth. Elizabeth reportedly claimed that some had been aided by witchcraft, feeding gossip about her household's darker leanings. Despite her reputation for severity, Elizabeth's children were cared for by governesses and staff, much as she herself had been raised. It was not uncommon for aristocratic children to be raised at arm's length, their lives structured by custom and ceremony rather than maternal intimacy. Ferenc's health began to decline around 1601, struck by a mysterious illness that paralyzed his legs and rendered him increasingly frail. As his condition worsened, Elizabeth stepped further into the role of estate manager, handling intricate legal and economic matters with precision. Ferenc died in 1604 at the age of 48, having entrusted his widow and heirs to Georgi Thurzo, a trusted ally who would later lead the investigation into Elizabeth's alleged crimes. His passing marked a pivotal turning point. Elizabeth, now in her mid-40s, wielded extraordinary wealth and independence, her authority nearly unmatched among noble women of her time. In summary, Elizabeth Bathory's marriage was a complex partnership forged in privilege, war, and ambition. Through years of separation, conflict, and growing autonomy, she transitioned from a noble bride to the undisputed mistress of castle and land, her domain soon to be eclipsed by darkness. After the death of Ferenc Nadasdy, Elizabeth Bathory's cruelty reportedly deepened, her castle at Čachtice becoming the stage for some of the darkest acts in early modern European history. The stories that emerged, pieced together from testimonies and terrified whispers, are chilling not only for their brutality, but also for their intimacy. Each act, every victim, reveals a haunting portrait of suffering behind stone walls. Elizabeth's victims were mostly young girls, often between 10 and 14 years old, lured to the castle by promises of work or opportunity. Initially peasants, her reach expanded to the daughters of lesser nobility sent for education, none spared by status or appeal. Each one entered with hope, only to be stripped of everything: clothes, freedom, and ultimately life. In the castle's dim cellars and cold chambers, witnesses claimed Elizabeth ordered girls to be stripped, bound, and beaten for hours. Their screams echoed off the damp stone, mixing with the grim silence of those too frightened to plead. Blood would pool on the floor, so thick sometimes that servants had to scatter ashes to soak it up. Some poor souls were smeared with honey from head to toe and forced outside, vulnerable to the relentless swarm of ants, wasps, and flies. With each sting and bite, dignity and hope melted away, a slow, natural torture that left the victims sobbing in unbearable agony as the Countess allegedly looked on, unmoved. Others were forced into ice baths during Hungary's harsh winters, left to shiver and suffer. Their skin, exposed and vulnerable, was numbed by cold until death gently, or not so gently, came. Survivors spoke of frostbitten bodies dragged from barrels, lips blue and limbs rigid with suffering. The violence escalated with a near ritualistic brutality. Bathory drove, sewing needles under fingernails, cut off noses, lips, and sometimes ears. She burned parts of the flesh, including, it said, the genitals with heated spoons, keys, or even candles. Some sources recount that she used fire irons to sear skin, and that she herself would pinch or tear flesh from her victims, sometimes with tongs, sometimes with her own teeth. She reportedly bit and tore at shoulders and breasts, whipping with stinging nettles, acting much like a wild animal when overcome by rage or illness. Servants told tales of her biting anyone who approached during her bouts of sickness, leaving wounds that festered and scarred. Perhaps the most legendary and disputed accusation is that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of virgins. According to some tales, after striking a servant and seeing blood on her skin, she noticed what she believed was renewed youth in her own flesh. Thus began the rumored ritualistic killings, in which bathing in victims' blood was a quest for eternal beauty. Modern historians are divided. Some argue this was a myth fed by misogyny and disbelief in female violence. Others see it as the inevitable escalation of Bathory's private horrors. Behind every grisly detail is a bewildered girl, pulled from home, stripped of identity and hope, forced to endure extraordinary pain. Witnesses, neighbors, and even castle servants were not only observers, but became haunted by what they had seen, forced into complicity and silence. Elizabeth herself, powerful and feared, appears in these stories as both orchestrator and isolated figure, her cruelty growing even as her loneliness deepened. These acts, documented through hundreds of testimonies and a legacy of horror, cut through time, forcing the world to grapple not only with one woman's alleged depravity, but also with the question of how unchecked power and secrecy can twist privilege into suffering. By the turn of the 17th century, the grim rumors about Elizabeth Bathory's castle could no longer be confined to frightened whispers. The deaths of peasant girls had been overlooked for years, but when daughters of lesser nobility vanished behind cactus walls, concerns swept the Hungarian court. Instead of dismissing the rumors as peasant hysteria, officials demanded answers. The tragedy was not just the scale of suffering, but the silence it had been met with until power was threatened. As the death toll grew, villagers began to hide their daughters when Bathory or her retainers came recruiting. Accounts from survivors and castle staff described rooms stained with old blood, basins overflowing, the air perpetually heavy with dread. Some girls arrived in good health, only to be found barely alive, swollen, bruised, and broken days or weeks later. Servants reportedly kept meticulous lists, recording up to 650 victims, though no such ledger was ever found, and some scholars believe it another layer of myth. Behind each statistic were real people, girls who wanted only a better life, families who grieved in secret, and servants forced to obey or risk their own lives. The dark corridors of Cactus absorbed not just their shrieks, but their hope and innocence. Every act of violence an echo that carried through generations. Elizabeth herself, isolated and unsparing, ruled the horror with an iron will. The castle became not just a scene of crimes, but a monument to her unraveling humanity. Soon, the deaths of noble-born girls inspired intervention. In 1609, King Matthias II sent Count Georgi Thurzo to investigate, leading to Elizabeth's arrest and the infamous trials that would shake Hungarian society and the Bathory legacy forever. The horror was now inescapable, too vast, too bloody to be ignored. When King Matthias II ordered a thorough investigation, Elizabeth Bathory's world shifted overnight. The scale and publicity of the accusations were unprecedented, even for a noble of her standing. By December 29, 1610, Count Georgy Thurzo and a formidable party of soldiers, family members, and royal officials descended upon Čachtice Castle. The village shivered in anticipation. For years, they'd whispered of what transpired within the cold stone walls. That fateful night, Elizabeth was not found hovering above a fresh corpse, nor was she performing some blood-chilling ritual. She was quietly dining with her household. But the search that followed was harrowing. One girl lay dead, another terrified and battered, yet alive, concealed in the castle. The horror was now undeniable, no longer wrapped in rumor, but made real by the sight of flesh and fear. Thurzo, both Elizabeth's cousin and king's agent, declared her guilt before villagers and guests. It is said he told his wife he found the lady red-handed, though sources suggest this was more theater than strict truth. As word of her arrest traveled, the castle staff, servants, maids, and stable hands were dragged to Bitka, Thurzo's estate, for brutal questioning. Over 300 witness testimonies would ultimately be collected, but it's critical to remember, not a single direct victim lived to speak. Instead, families recounted children sent for education who never returned, and castle officials described bodies found badly mutilated or hastily buried on the grounds. The judicial process was swift and cruel. On January 2nd and 7th, 1611, Thurzo presided over 2 secretive trials. Servants accused of aiding the Countess faced horrific torture before confessing. Their stories painted Elizabeth as both instigator and spectral overseer, presiding over each torment. These confessions fed the growing legend, as local officials and clergy peered behind a veil of aristocratic privilege. 3 servants, Dorotia Semtesh, Ilona Joe, and Janos Ujeri, were executed with extraordinary brutality. Fingers torn out with hot pincers, then their bodies burned. Another, Katerina Benica, received life imprisonment after testimony showed she herself was regularly abused by the others. One woman, Urtsi Majorova, was irrevocably cast as a witch and was burned alive after a separate trial. Imagine this. For decades, Elizabeth's staff had been both silent witnesses and accessories, living in daily dread, wondering if obedience would save them or make them complicit. On the day of arrest, some sobbed in relief, others cowered in fear, many knowing their own deaths were now certain. The villagers, too, who once tried in vain to protect their daughters, could only watch as Thurzo's men drag away everyone associated with the cursed castle. For Elizabeth herself, the end was icy and abrupt. There was no public trial. Instead, the Bathory family negotiated with the authorities. Better to see her silenced in a sealed chamber than allow the scandal to strip the family of ties to their land and centuries-old privilege. Elizabeth was walled up alone in her rooms at Čachtice. Windows and doors were bricked over. Only a small opening remained for food and water to be passed inside. The world moved on as powerful families divided her lands. Some officials remained convinced of her guilt, pointing to the physical evidence and the terrorized survivors, while others, then and now, wondered if political motives and gendered suspicion may have fueled the scale and theatrics of her punishment. In the end, Elizabeth's silence was total. She died, untried and unseen, in August 1614. Her crime, her legacy, and her suffering, these now belong to the myth that shadows every cold stone at Čachtice, and to the haunted tales retold across generations. Elizabeth Bathory's final years were spent in confined solitude at Čachtice Castle. The walls that once echoed with screams, now canvases for silence. Unlike the terrifying tales often told, historical records suggest her imprisonment was less about brutal isolation and more akin to house arrest. a gilded cage with servants attending to her needs, but a fortress with no escape. The image of Elizabeth walled into a tiny chamber is widely popular but debated. Priests who visited her in 1614 noted she was able to roam parts of the castle unhindered, escorted of course, but far from physically walled in. At 54, she complained of cold hands one evening and retired to her chambers, slipping away quietly in the night of August 21st, 1614. Her body was buried in the local church, but accounts suggest the villagers' disgust led to her remains being transferred to the Bathory family crypt in her birthplace of Ext, Hungary. The exact resting place of Elizabeth's remains remains unknown, shrouded in mystery, much like her life and death. Yet, as her physical presence faded, the stories about Elizabeth Bathory only grew darker and more distorted. Over centuries, her legacy transformed from historical tragedy into legend, her image morphing into that of a vampire-like figure obsessed with eternal youth, bathing in the blood of virgins. These tales, while captivating, blur the line between fact and fiction. Some modern historians argue that her notoriety was magnified by political enemies eager to appropriate her lands after her husband's death, and by social fears of a powerful woman wielding autonomy in a male-dominated world. Elizabeth's life had been both privileged and brutal, a reflection of her time as much as her unique path. Her vast estates and influence made her a formidable figure, but also a target. The cancellation of a large royal debt owed to her family following her arrest reveals a political dimension to her downfall, suggesting that her trial may have been as much about seizing power as punishing crime. Regardless of the truth behind the accusations, Elizabeth Bathory remains a haunting symbol of cruelty, power, and the perilous intersection where myth and history entwine. Čachtice Castle, now a picturesque ruin, invites visitors to walk the same halls once ruled by a woman whose ghosts still linger in shadows and whispers. Her story serves as a stark reminder. History remembers not only those who lived, but often those who were feared, misunderstood, or demonized. Elizabeth's legacy challenges us to question how power, gender, and fear shape stories that echo through time. As we close the dark pages of Elizabeth Bathory's story, the question lingers. Was she truly a monster born of blood and cruelty, or a woman ensnared by the ruthless politics and fears of her time? What do you think? Could there be more to her tale than history's cruel myths? Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments below. I love hearing your perspectives and diving deeper into these haunted histories with you. If you found this story as chilling and captivating as I did, please make sure to subscribe to Heinous Crime Files. Together, we'll uncover more twisted tales and forgotten terrors from the shadows of history. So hit that bell and stay tuned for our next ascent into the darkest chapters of human nature. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the darkest stories hold the most illuminating truths.